Guys, just a follow-up video. I saw a lot of people comment about, Canelo and Ward, and it got a lot of reaction. A lot of people saying, Ward will beat Canelo. Some of you saying Canelo beats Ward. Some of the Canelo fans going back, some of the, Ward fans. Ward was a great fighter, no doubt about it. And obviously my brother was quite blunt. He said that, no, Ward wins that fight. That Ward, smash the like button on this video, guys. Hit the subscribe button. Make sure to hit the like button on this video before we get into it. And I know we've already started the video, but smash the like button, guys. I really appreciate the support. And we maybe do a live stream on this and we can discuss this. But let me get into it. My brother actually said that Ward beats Canelo. And it may well have been the case. Sometimes, here's what we got to understand, and even Canelo fans. For me, this is my opinion. Now, you guys, some of you may not agree with it. For me, Canelo is a greater fighter than Andre Ward. What I mean by that is accomplishments. For me, Canelo's achieved a lot more than Andre Ward in boxing. He's won titles in many different weight classes. He's gone above and beyond. If he goes to cruiserweight as well, if he cleans out 175 as well, and Mike said, and here's what Mike said. Mike said, I remember we did a live stream, and I remember Mike saying that Canelo's career is still going on. And he said, at this point, if you were to ask me who wins Ward v Canelo, I would say Andre Ward. But in a couple years' time, depending on what Canelo achieves and who Canelo goes on to beat, my opinion might change. And I'm a bit like that as well. If I'm going to be brutally honest with you, I actually think Canelo would have given Ward hell. But if you were to put me on the spot, right now I would slightly favor Ward because Ward was bigger than Canelo. He was very good, very boring, Andre Ward. As Salman said yesterday, he was a very boring fighter. But he knew how to negate fighters. So Ward would have been a very, very big problem for Canelo. However, Canelo over the last years has shown that, you know what? He's starting to show that he's a very versatile fighter. He's a very, very dangerous fighter. He's a very good pressure fighter. And he's becoming very intelligent inside the boxing ring. And he's got something that Ward didn't have, and that's power. Canelo's got serious dynamite in his hands. And that would have been a problem. And here's the thing. A lot of people say, well, who's Canelo beat as good as Andre Ward? Well, who's Ward beat as good as Canelo? No one really. When you think I know people are going to say Kovalev. Kovalev isn't better than Canelo. He's bigger than Canelo. Do you understand? See, this is where people... Kovalev, for me, is a bigger man. Yeah. But he's not a better fighter. He's not got better ring IQ. He hasn't got... For me, he hasn't got the versatility that Canelo's got. So Canelo's a greater fighter than Kovalev. Even though if you think Kovalev prime for prime would have beaten Canelo in their prime, maybe, possibly so, Kovalev may have beaten Canelo prime for prime. But that doesn't mean he's a greater fighter. Do you understand where I'm coming from? Just because somebody might be able to beat because they're bigger. Klitschko beats Mayweather because he's so much bigger. But that doesn't mean Klitschko's a greater fighter than Mayweather, does it? Gennady Golovkin may have beaten Floyd Mayweather. But is Gennady Golovkin a greater fighter than Floyd Mayweather? The answer is no. The answer is no. Because the only reason Golovkin would win is because he's bigger. Not because he's better. Because he's bigger. Because the size would play a huge factor. So the point I'm trying to make is that Andre Ward is the same kind of case. For me, Andre Ward's not greater than Canelo. Because Canelo's done a lot more in the game, right? And when people talk about Andre Ward's resume, Canelo's beaten the best guy that Andre Ward beat, which was Kovalev. And people may say, well, it was a more shot version. Irrelevant. Canelo knocked out Kovalev. Irrespective of how the fight was going, he stopped Kovalev. Even if you think it's a faded version. All the guys that Andre Ward beat in the Super 6, I know Steven pointed out that Andre would beat a lot of guys in the Super Six. Canelo would have beaten all those guys. There's no one in the Super Six that would have beaten, who was the best guy that, would beat in the Super Six? Kessler, Froch. Those guys were very one-dimensional, they were guys with good chins and stuff, and they used to come forward, but they wouldn't have beaten Canelo. So the point I'm trying to make is, like, who did Ward beat when Ward won the Super Six that was as good as Canelo? The answer is nobody. Because all the guys like Darrell and all those guys, Canelo would have played with those guys. And he may have, with some of them, like, for me, Canelo would have been as dominant against someone like Froch and Kessler as Ward was, but he would have been more brutal. I actually think Canelo might have even been able to stop Froch. And people may say, I'm crazy, Froch has got a great chin. But I'm telling you, because Canelo was a monster. And Canelo hitting Froch consistently. Remember, Ward wasn't a big puncher. Canelo was an explosive puncher. Froch had a very poor defense. There was a good chance Canelo could have ironed him out. And the other thing is, would Froch even land on Canelo? Because Canelo, we all know, has got a very tricky defense, and Froch isn't the fastest. So these are the best guys that Ward beat. I know Steven said about Chad Dawson, but Chad Dawson was past his best, man. He wasn't the best. Was he the best version of himself when he fought Andre Ward? I don't know. So, like I said to you, I do think Andre Ward's a great fighter. There's no doubt about it. But I do think when I look through his resume, a lot of those guys were good fighters. They weren't, the guys that Andre Ward beat. Kovalev was the only elite fighter that he beat, in my opinion. I wouldn't call Kessler, Froch, Darrell. Did he fight Darrell? I don't think he did. I'm not sure if Andre Ward fought Darrell. But the other guys he fought Arthur Abraham, and those guys, they're not elite fighters. They're good fighters. But Canelo would have destroyed Canelo would have beat Arthur Abraham. He would have beat Carl Froch, Kessler. He would have beaten all those guys. Those guys wouldn't have beaten Canelo Alvarez. So when I look at Andre Ward's resume, like I said, Canelo would have beaten everybody that Andre Ward beat. So this is what I'm trying to say is, when people say, well, who did Canelo fight like Andre Ward? Well, who did Andre Ward fight like Canelo? Nobody. He hasn't fought anybody as great and as good as Canelo. So this is what I mean. I feel like you're judging Andre Ward fighting the guys that he fought, but none of them were Canelo. Canelo's a completely different beast of a fighter. That wouldn't have been an easy fight for Andre Ward. At all. Like, a lot of people think that Ward would have done this, that. I'm telling you, that would have been a tough fight. For Andre Ward. Would have been a very difficult fight. Because Canelo is not an easy fight for anybody. Canelo's a very, very good fighter. Very, very good fighter. Very intelligent fighter. And he's also, remember, Canelo's also very good defensively as well. Not just Andre Ward. Andre Ward does it in an ugly way. Canelo his defensive work is genius at times. It's really good to watch. It's great to watch when Canelo makes people miss. Andre Ward was a very boring fighter, by the way. Great fighter, but boring fighter. Canelo's, I wouldn't say he's the most exciting fighter, but he is exciting to watch. You look forward to a Canelo fight. I'm not saying he's a Roy Jones or he's like that kind of exciting, but he's definitely exciting. Andre Ward was quite, he used to nullify his opponents and quite boring to watch, but he was very effective. But to say that Canelo didn't fight anyone compared to Andre Ward, well, Andre Ward didn't fight anyone as good as Canelo, so it works both ways. Andre Ward was a bigger man. And like I said earlier, I think because Andre Ward was bigger and Andre Ward was also great, because Andre Ward was an elite fighter, Canelo was an elite fighter, but the size would play a difference because Canelo, the guys that he fought at 168, they weren't elite. They were okay, good fighters. Andre Ward's elite. So when you're a bigger guy, you're a bigger man, and then you're fighting another elite fighter, which Andre Ward was, it becomes very difficult for you because you're fighting another guy that's bigger than you and he's elite. So size would play a big part. It would make Ward a favorite in the fight because of the fact that he's bigger. But Canelo would be that would be a hard fight. Ward could lose that fight. No doubt about it. You know, Ward could lose that fight. Because Ward, I wouldn't say Ward was chinny, because a lot of people did say early on that Ward was chinny, which he's not. Ward had a fairly good chin and he was not easy to catch. I just think Ward was fairly strong on the inside. Ward was very effective, but so is Canelo. And Ward doesn't really have the power to dent Canelo, in my opinion. Whereas Canelo has the kind of power to dent Ward if Canelo catches Ward, you know? That would have been a great fight. Honestly, it would have been a great fight. It would have been a very, very good fight. And Ward would have had a lot of difficulty in that fight. So would have Canelo, because Ward was great at nullifying opponents. He was very difficult fighter to kind of get on top of. He was just so composed inside that ring, very smart, very good boxing IQ. Yeah, just a very good, smart fighter, very skillful fighter. So that would have been definitely one of Canelo's difficult fights. But yeah, I think Ward's a great fighter. I do rate Ward. I think he's quality, but again, when I look at Ward's career, I don't really think he had I don't think he had as many marquee fights. Like, I think he had Kovalev, but a lot of the other guys that he fought were okay fighters. You know, I don't feel like he fought a lot of elite fighters in his career. And that really hurts him. Like, he didn't really have a Canelo. He didn't really have a Calzaghe. He didn't really have guys of that level, or a Roy Jones. He didn't really have anyone, or a Bernard Hopkins in his prime. He didn't really have those level of fighters to really be tested. And he moved up and fought Kovalev. And I thought he lost the first fight, personally. I thought he lost against Kovalev the first time. And then, listen, he avenged the loss. He avenged a lot of people thought he lost the first time, which was credit to him, because he didn't need to fight Kovalev again. He did get the win on paper. But I think Andre Ward couldn't have retired or couldn't have left the sport on that win that he had with Kovalev the first fight, because people would have always said, nah, you didn't win that fight. You know, I personally think he did lose against Kovalev the first time. I just thought Kovalev edged that fight. I thought the knockdown should have been the difference. But, you know, the judges saw it the way they saw it. Ward came back in the rematch and stopped him. But I do think that Canelo's a completely different kettle of fish. Kovalev, we know, wasn't living the life. You know, there was rumors about Kovalev, and Ward lives the life. Canelo lives the life. And Canelo stays in the gym. So all around the board, Canelo would have been Ward's toughest fight, in my opinion. I think Canelo would have been a very, very tough fight, because especially this version of Canelo. I don't think there's anyone in history that would have been able to completely dominate Canelo. I just think Canelo's too good to be dominated. That Floyd Mayweather, yeah, that was very early on, and I don't think Canelo was as developed. But this version of I would be very impressed, even if somebody at light heavyweight is able to dominate Canelo. Like, if Beterbiev or Bivol or someone, they're able to dominate Canelo, I'd be very impressed, because I don't see this version of Canelo being dominated by anybody. So when I talk about Canelo and Andre Ward, and I just think that sometimes Canelo's given a bad rap and he doesn't get the credit for what he's done. And people automatically think, well, Ward beat all these guys in the Super 6. But sometimes you've got to think back and sit back and think, none of those guys were Canelo. Doesn't matter who he fought in the Super 6. None of those guys are greater or better fighters than Canelo. And Canelo would have beaten all the guys that Andre Ward beat at 168. Not even a question in my mind. He would have beaten the guys at 168. Kessler, Froch, Abraham, all of these guys would have got beaten easily. You know, I'm very confident he would have beaten all those guys. Right? And I actually think some of the guys that Canelo fought, like Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, even Billy Joe, would have given some guys like Arthur Abraham, Kessler, good fights. Froch, they would have given them good fights. Trust me when I say that. Caleb Plant would have given Froch a good fight. You know, Callum Smith would have given Froch a good fight. Even Billy Joe would have given Froch those wouldn't have been easy fights for those guys. You know, like, yeah, maybe Canelo made them look easy, but they wouldn't have been easy fights for those guys. Trust me. Yeah, were those guys better than these guys? Yeah, they were. But they weren't like miles better. Do you see what I mean? I think these guys would have been able to give those guys good fights. Let's not forget, Carl Froch fought, you know, and that was one of Andre Ward's best wins. Carl Froch fought Darrell, right? And a lot of people thought Darrell won that. Pascal, the fight was very close, you know. And is Darrell way better than Caleb Plant? Is Pascal way better than Callum Smith? I beg to differ. I don't think I think maybe slightly better, not way better. Do you know what I mean? So this is what I mean. I think sometimes, you know, we look into things too much, like, oh, the Super Six and he won that. Yeah, Andre Ward was no doubt a world-class fighter, but I don't think his resume is as great as what some people seem to think. You know, I'm not sure if his resume is as good as what some people think. He was a great fighter, no doubt about it. But to say that, you know, well, Canelo, you know, he won the Super Six and Canelo wouldn't have been able... No, because Canelo would have beaten all the guys that Andre Ward beat as well. At 168, I'm very confident he would have. So I still stand by my words. I think Canelo would have been a tough fight for Andre Ward, and I think Andre Ward would have been a tough fight for Canelo. But I don't look at the you know, weight classes and think that, you know what, Andre Ward fought way better fighters. Yeah, he fought better fighters and he had a much harder 168 division. But it was like a lot of those guys, like I said, think about it. Would Callum Smith give Carl Froch a good fight? The answer is yes. Would Callum Smith give Andre Darrell a good fight? The answer is yes. So, you know, I think sometimes we look into these things a bit too much. I do think that Ward would have been a favorite in the fight, but I don't think it would have been a shock if Canelo had beaten him. Canelo's a great fighter. And like I said, that would be Ward's toughest fight at 168 by a country mile. You know, Canelo had way better boxing skills than anyone Ward got in the ring with at 168. He, in my opinion, as big, if not bigger puncher than anybody that Ward got in the ring with. Better defensively than anybody that Ward got in the ring with. So Canelo is just a complete fighter. So I don't really think that it would have been an easy fight for Andre Ward. I think Canelo would have given Andre Ward all kinds of trouble. But leave your thoughts, guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you disagree with me, leave your thoughts. And guys, remember to please like, share, subscribe to my channel. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.